Welcome to the Psychology Podcast, where we give you insights into the mind, brain, behavior, and creativity. I'm Dr. Scott Barry Kaufman, and in each episode I have a conversation with a guest who will stimulate your mind and give you a greater understanding of yourself, others, and the world we live in. Hopefully we'll also provide a glimpse into human possibility. Thanks for listening and enjoy the podcast. Today, it's really great to have Coleman Hughes on the podcast. Coleman is an undergraduate philosophy major at Columbia University and a columnist for Quillette magazine. His writing has been featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, City Journal, and the Spectator. Coleman, so great to have you on the Psychology Podcast, finally.
Great to be on, Scott.
I've wanted to have you on for a while, and I've known you not only for your intellectual prowess, but also as a human, and I thought we could start there. Let's let our audience know a little bit more about Coleman. You are, I don't know if you would accept the phrase polymath, but you are quite good at multiple things. So one thing is you're a musician, right?
Yep, musician. I play trombone, piano, drums a little bit. Trombone is my best instrument, and that was my initial plan for life, was to be a jazz trombonist out of high school.
Really? So were you in all-state, what were you like in high school?
I did all those things, yeah.
Yeah.
Did all the all-state bands, and I did the national bands and all of that stuff.
So why did you choose Columbia University philosophy?
So it's a little bit of it's not really so long a story, but I guess the short version is I went to Juilliard out of high school, and then, let's say 6 months into my Juilliard education, my mother passed away, and I went home to be with my family with the intention of coming back. But while I was at home, sort of grieving, I, discovered, not really for the first time, but intensified a love of reading and philosophical thinking that suggested to me that I should really pursue that seriously. And that was mixed with a disappointment at the feeling that I wasn't learning very much at Juilliard. There was a distance between how I felt I learned in a classroom where a music teacher was trying to impart knowledge that is not easily imparted in a classroom, which is to say artistic knowledge. And there's a distance between that and how I felt I had learned music up until that point, which was, just through experience and solitary learning and pursuing specific mentors. And I was dissatisfied with, with my experience there. So I figured, there was also just a sense that music was very much my escape as a teenager. And for it to become my curriculum, there was something upsetting about that as well.
Yeah, thank you. I didn't know that about your mother. I'm very sorry to hear that. And I'm wondering to what extent you kind of associated music with your mother as well, and maybe did you lose any motivation after she passed away?
No, I think it's a bit the opposite. Not quite, but my mother was never the one pushing me to do music. She was actually quite unmusical. She had a good sense of rhythm and could dance, especially salsa. But she was nearly tone deaf. So I sort of went to Juilliard despite her. Not to spite her, but despite her.
Sure. No, of course.
She wanted me to go to a liberal arts college.
So she'd be very proud of you right now.
Yeah, I think she'd be very happy with my choice to go to Columbia rather than Juilliard. Yeah.
So yeah, even your childhood, were you very intellectual in school? Were you in gifted education, for instance?
Yes, I was. I was always very good at school from the beginning.
Yeah.
And by that, I mean I was good at math. Always was my strongest. but I was strong across the board. Music as well, very, very weak in visual arts, and above average but not stellar at athletics.
But you play basketball now, right?
I do, yeah.
We're gonna play basketball. I'm gonna whoop your
We
ass
are.
someday, right?
I don't know about that, Scott. We'll see.
We'll see. That's right. Maybe we'll film it. We'll film that for a bonus for the Psychology Podcast. Yeah. So I really appreciate you talking so vulnerably about all this. I think it's important, to kind of know a little bit more about who you are as a human. I think that, you kind of came out the gate here at Quillette, and even like for some people, their first image of you was testifying against Congress, not against Congress, sorry, testifying for Congress against reparations.
Although it felt that way.
I'm sure it did
like
feel that way. That probably was
against.
a Freudian slip. And I think, part of what I want to do today as well is kind of put a human face to you as well. And what I've gotten to know about you is you're incredibly thoughtful, incredibly compassionate human being who tried to understand all different sides of a story. You don't just want to be told what to think. You like to think freely. So, yeah, I hope you're okay with me kind of painting more of a human face for you today.
Oh, yeah, that's awesome. That's great.
So you got into college, and then I feel like there was, I think you wrote this in one of your articles, there was kind of this turning point. You had thoughts about race and society, and then you had a roommate, is that right, who kind of altered your thinking a little bit along these regards? Didn't you have like a transformation in some way?
Yeah, like most transformations, it wasn't overnight, but I grew up in a very liberal left setting. I knew exactly one Republican that I can think of growing up, my fifth grade teacher. So that's the water in which I swam. My mother was something close to a Marxist and used to talk to me often about Marx and Gramsci and Durkheim when I was as young as 5 years old. And so, I sort of grew up with a general a liberal orientation towards race, but not at all a highly race conscious orientation. What I mean by that is, if you had asked me at 13 years old if I knew what white privilege was, or if I would have thought to, say a black person's opinion on this is more valid than a white person's, that would have been an alien idea to me. I came very much from a more Martin Luther King school of thinking, where it was, deeply opposed and aware of racism, but not at all inclined to judge people on the basis of their skin. But that changed when I was 16 or 17. This would probably be 2012, 2013. Went to a conference called the People of Color Conference in Dallas as part of a small envoy from my school. And there were, hundreds, maybe over 1,000 kids there from all across the country. And it was a conference where we learned about intersectionality and critical race theory.
Very hot topics today.
Yeah, but unheard of to me and my friends at that point. Our first exposure. And it was markedly different than anything I had heard in my life about the subject, from my family, from my teachers. It was importantly different, more muscular in ideology, and it was appealing to me in many ways. It said to me, it took little experiences I had of alienation as a result of my being black and planted them like seeds and grew this entire tree of ideology about how the country wasn't built for me and all of my problems could be explained. Any alienation I feel as a person can be explained by the distance between the purpose for which my country was created and my place in it as a black person, So that was, I suppose, the beginning of my social justice-y phase, where I became comfortable calling people out, white people, for saying things I didn't agree with or like or felt were offensive. And so that was the first transformation, really. And then the reverse transformation was a slow awareness that many of those ideas were maybe based on kernels of truth, but really misguided in fundamental ways. Meeting more people from around the country with different views and different life experiences, and reading, learning more about the world, and coming around to the point of view I have now, which is, much more like what I learned as a child, much more in the vein of Martin Luther King, that, the founding ideals of this country were really premised on the individual over the group. And as the country evolved and dealt with the question of slavery and Jim Crow, that evolved into a concern for the individual regardless of their race. And the idea that the way to fight racism is not to throw it in reverse, but to insist that the color of a person's skin is truly, upon reflection, an irrelevant characteristic of them. So that's been sort of the way that, and I can give more detail about how that transition came about if you want, but that's
something with
my summary of it.
Thank you. There was something with a roommate, right?
Yeah. So, my friend from Arizona who I roomed with at Juilliard freshman year, this was, we were moving in together right as the Michael Brown Ferguson story, the Ferguson riots were happening, and Michael Brown had been killed. And coming from my context, it seemed obvious that his killing was unjust, that this was an example of racism, that any ulterior, that it was a simple good versus evil story. It was about as complicated as Star Wars. And that was my picture of the national reaction to the Michael Brown story. And my roommate, who, was sort of had been my best friend and was continuing to become my best friend, he didn't have the same reaction. The mere thought that he might have sympathy for the cop's perspective was bizarre to me. But I think the fact of our friendship allowed me to take it seriously. And we were in a class, a humanities class at Juilliard, and we're discussing it. And because of discussing it with him, I realized that I should actually read the transcripts of the testimonies from Darren Wilson, the police officer, and I think Dorian something, Michael Brown's friend, who had opposing testimonies on the issue. And so I remember staying up till 2 or 3 a.m. reading the entirety of the testimonies, coming away thinking that not only did I not know who was right, nobody opining on the issue probably knew who was right. And so the confidence of people that I had up to that point seen as being on the right side of the issue seemed unwarranted to me. And I remember that being that was an important moment for the country. It was also an important moment for me.
Thank you for we got to hear Coleman's origin story a bit. So thank you for talking about that. So, we can dive into some of these issues. These issues strike such an emotional chord, one could argue rightly so. So, and you've put a lot of thought into the various different perspectives that are on the table. So I thought, for each of these topics that I'm going to bring up, I thought we could explore your thoughts as well as maybe some trying to anticipate the critics' thoughts as well. I love doing that. So the idea of intersectionality, because you've written an article for Quillette about your sort of nuanced views on that. Can you, how has your thinking evolved at all on that topic? And what is your current thinking?
I wrote that article very recently, so I can't say my thinking has evolved.
That's okay.
But basically,
it doesn't have to evolve.
My argument there was intersectionality. This is born from Kimberly Crenshaw, the legal theorist, law professor at Columbia, as it happens, right? Columbia Law School.
Mm-hmm, that's right.
She came up with the idea in the late 80s. And the basic, it was in response to specific legal cases where neither anti-racist laws nor anti-sexist laws covered the kind of discrimination that Black women in particular were alleged to be facing. So there are just situations where Black women as a class, were being plausibly discriminated against, but because you could not look at racism and sexism simultaneously, you actually couldn't find employers guilty of that kind of discrimination, right? Because the employer could show that we're hiring white women, therefore we're not violating sexism, and we're hiring Black men, therefore we're not guilty of racism. Therefore, we couldn't possibly be discriminating against Black women, which isn't logically true. Or legally true. And so it was a narrow effort to come up with an intellectual framework that could deal with that question, which isn't super difficult intellectually, I would argue. But so the basic idea was Black women can face a kind of discrimination that is neither racism nor sexism, but some third thing. That only applies to Black women considered as a specific class independent of Black men or white women. And since then, it's blossomed into a kind of entire thought system that encompasses LGBTQ, encompasses class and disability. The idea that oppression is more than the sum of its parts. If you're gay and Black, you may experience something that neither a gay person nor a Black straight person experiences, but something only gay Black people experience. You suffer from an additional layer of discrimination. So more than the sum of its parts is the key concept to intersectionality. My critique of what intersectionality has become, and I don't think Kimberly Crenshaw intended for it to become this all-encompassing thought system. One of my critiques is just that it's an armchair philosophy, which is to say it's not a philosophy that people went out and studied the degree to which different people were oppressed in the world, gathered the data, and then plausibly constructed a theory to fit the world. It's just something that sounded good in people's heads, right? It sounds good to say that Black women experience an extra layer of discrimination relative to Black men and are therefore worse off. They experience 3 kinds of discrimination where Black men only experience 1, racism. But if you actually think about it, it's not obvious that Black women are worse off than Black men. Yes, Black women are far more vulnerable to rape, sexual violence, sexual assault, domestic violence, a few other issues I could think of. On the other hand, over 90% of Black people in prison are men. Black men are more likely to be murdered, much more likely to commit suicide. So the point is not that one group is worse off than the other. The point is that it's actually a very difficult and interesting question. And intersectionality dismisses that question before it's even been meaningfully asked and says this group in this very simplistic mathematical way, suffers 3 layers of oppression. This other group only suffers 1. And that erases most of what is actually going on in the real world.
Well, as a scientist, I'm trying to think of how one would even precisely quantify such things. And also there's kind of an assumption there about kind of a hierarchy of victimhood that we can assign quantitatively different forms of oppression and suffering to different combinations of things. And that's hard to scientifically capture as well. And I'm sympathetic to arguments like I understand all else being equal, if I, it's better off being white. The all else being equal, I can understand scientifically, even like you control for other variables. But so I really do get that. I'm sympathetic to that. I think that it becomes really tricky once you start having like a hierarchy of victimhood that's objective. Like you're claiming objective truth about like, no, if you're this combination, you're definitely going to suffer more than if you're this combination, then if you're in this combination, then in this combination. I guess I'm wondering to the extent to which comparing different people's combinations of sufferings is the best way forward for like universal peace.
So like, here's the thing, is that there are a lot of patterns and regularities that are true about races that have exceptions. So like the idea that, being a white person in America is correlated with being privileged is true. The idea that everything else held equal, having white skin rather than black skin in the average situation more often than not, with exceptions, confers an advantage. That could be true. Probably is true. The question is, when are racial stereotypes admissible and when are they not? So, I mean, I could easily grant that everything else held equal, more often than not, having white skin is an advantage. And I could come up with all kinds of counterexamples where having black skin is an advantage, but let's just say that there are fewer of those than there are of the rule. Those are exceptions to the rule. It's still the case that you're coarse graining a country of 350 million people, all of whom have different experiences. You're reducing race relations to a stereotype, namely that having white skin is an advantage, right? And the truth is, stereotypes can be true more often than not, but that doesn't suggest that we should deal in stereotypes, right? Imagine if we're going to observe the racial patterns in crime commission or test scores, right? And come up with concepts that are true with plenty of exceptions about every race, right? There's a reason why we've developed a norm against racial stereotyping, and it's not because stereotypes are always inaccurate. It's because they always misfire in enough cases, and that misfiring can be enormously insulting to the people on the receiving end of the stereotype, that we've just developed this norm of not stereotyping people, treating people as individuals. Like to take an example that is like close to home, I don't know if you ever get like Clary alerts, right?
I do, yeah.
Clary crime alerts.
Barnard, right? Or Columbia?
Yeah. So like in the area you and I live in, we get an alert if there's a crime that happens. By law, we have to. I think I noticed one white person in the last several months.
Yeah.
But that just proves the point, right?
Yeah.
It's like I went months without seeing a single white face.
I've been thinking about that.
And so here's the point. The few times in my life that I've been stereotyped for being black, I can understand how that stereotype may have been born of some, pattern recognition or maybe it was Hollywood tropes or whatever. But let's say it just is, for the sake of argument, born of like that pattern recognition. People are always seeing black faces in the Clary crime reports. It just so happens that the demographics of crime in this area are very racially disproportionate. That doesn't actually make it hurt less when I get stereotyped.
Yeah.
It doesn't. Because there's something about what's so hurtful about stereotypes is like we operate with this presumption of innocence, sort of, and you're presuming me guilty of something that turns out not to be true. And maybe 6 times out of 10 it would have been true or whatever. But still, that doesn't make it less hurtful. So if I put myself in the shoes of a white person who really has not seen white privilege work out in their lives, let's say they were passed over for a job and the boss told them, you were more qualified, but we have to get more diversity, right? That's a person who is not feeling white privilege. And let's say that person is the exception to the rule. Still, most people are feeling it. When they hear the term white privilege, they're going to be extremely mad, and they're right to be mad because it's a stereotype. And what group around the world, what racial group has ever reacted well to being stereotyped?
But if you're in what is perceived as the dominant group or the position of power, you're not allowed to call out instances that you perceive as racism against you.
Mm.
So some people would make that argument in the social justice movement. Have you come across that argument?
Yeah, sure, definitely.
Yeah. What do you see? Do you see a problem with that argument?
Yeah, well, there's a problem of moral logic to it. If you were to ask the question, why is racism bad, and come up with a philosophically rigorous answer, that answer has to appeal to some principle about race being an arbitrary fact about someone, being not sufficient reason to treat them differently. And it's hard to not see how that shouldn't also apply to the quote unquote dominant group. The second thing I would say is the word group and the language of group really, it is an abstraction. There is no such thing as the white community or the black community.
Right.
All of us know, the most popular among us have a few hundred friends, maybe. Most people have, fewer friends than that. So the group is just an idea in our heads. It's not really a reality on the ground. And it's useful to think and talk in terms of groups often, but it's often not. And so when I call my friend whose, parents committed suicide and who grew up, with like meth addicts as parents, part of the quote dominant group, what am I actually saying there that's meaningful? In what sense is he part of the dominant group? And in what sense is Malia Obama or myself part of the oppressed class? So that's another consideration, is just that the concept of groups is inappropriate and insufficient to the task of it's a bad constraint on the concept of racism, because groups are so diverse.
Right, within groups, there's probably more diversity than even between groups.
Yeah. And then the final thing I would say about that is it really just is a rejection of what the civil rights movement stood for. People resist this point. They quote Martin Luther King in half his moods and ignore most of the other things he said. If you look back, people who have used the term reverse racism without the quotation marks, which is to say have actually worried about racism against white people, in that group is not only cranky white male conservatives or whatever the stereotype is, it's also a Philip Randolph who originated the March on Washington movement and forced FDR to integrate the defense industries and the military. He used that phrase seriously. It's, Bayard Rustin, the organizer of the 1963 March on Washington. It's Nelson Mandela in the mid 90s. It's many other people who hardly had a naive idea of what it meant to suffer racism. And so I think it's unwise to throw away the principles that such people stood for, because they knew that their fight against racism depended upon preserving the principle that all racism is evil, all discrimination is ultimately evil, because race is ultimately arbitrary.
Absolutely. The thing that we share in common, and I don't think about race issues to the extent that you do this, but something that we both share is this drive for having more of a transcendent values in society, kind of values. Maybe you haven't phrased it in this way, but this is what I see as a commonality between us. I'm a humanistic psychologist. I'm really interested in how can we promote more of appreciation of kind of the uniqueness of each individual that we see, regardless of maybe superficial characteristics of that individual. Kind of transcend, kind of have universal moral principles that apply equally to everyone, in a society. So I think that we kind of share this, humanistic perspective on things. And it's really interesting for me and quite fascinating for me to watch you kind of apply a lot of this within this domain that is so important and relevant to the lives of so many people, within the race domain. But you can start building up these principles and applying it to anything in life. You can apply it to gender discrimination in the workplace. I wrote an article recently arguing why no one cares that there's underrepresentation of men in female-dominated fields. It seems to be so one-sided, and then trying to make the case for why it helps society to increase representation. So I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like there is this common drive for a very humanitarian perspective where, like, what will rise the tide for humanity, not just what will rise the tide for one in-group. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think as a matter of moral philosophy, it's very difficult to justify any point of view that does not rate individuals equally in terms of our desire to uplift them and help them flourish. I mean, it would be impossible to write a really coherent and persuasive argument. And I would argue this has been true for a few hundred years now, that the flourishing of some human beings is at bottom more important than others.
Yeah.
Period. That's just a very difficult intuition to pump, a very difficult proposition to defend. And we can forget that because, like, in the day-to-day, in the political sphere, it's very easy to lose principles, to lose sight of important principles.
Well, I agree with that. So wokeness. Let's talk about wokeness for a second now. What is wokeness, and do you have any criticisms whatsoever about sort of people who call themselves woke, kind of their ideologies?
I don't know exactly what wokeness is, but it's, I guess at first approximation, it's less a set of particular beliefs than a style of politics, like a sensibility or an instinct around how to view politics. It very much goes back to what I said earlier about viewing politics as a simple good versus evil, as having all the complexity of a Star Wars movie. Although Star Wars can get a little bit complex because, Anakin becomes Darth Vader, and at the end, when he dies, you kind of feel bad for him. So, like, something even much more simplistic. Um, I think it's true. Sometimes politics is that simple, but the vast majority of cases, it's not. And the woke mindset encourages you to view things through such a simple lens. There's just the right side of history and the wrong side of history. And it's as simple as shaming the bad people into agreeing with me. The answer is obvious. That's a key part of wokeness. The moral answer is obvious. It doesn't require deep thought. And what it requires is an active pursuit of power. The people we're talking to, the people on the other side, cannot be persuaded. That's also, I think, a key feature of wokeness. And one should know all of these features can be found on the political right as well. So wokeness is the politically left version of that Manichaean mindset.
Well,
as it manifests
that
today.
doesn't roll off the tongue as well as wokeness. We need a label for the right version of it that's not manic. I hear your argument now. Is there? Let's try to be fair a second to people who say they're woke. What points? Good points are they making about about people who are unwoke? Isn't it possible they are making some good points in the sense that a lot of us can be really ignorant of the suffering of those who have a different skin color from us, who have fundamentally different experiences because of their skin color or their disadvantage in some way that we're just not privy to. So that therefore, aren't there unwoke people? What does that even mean? I'm really trying to think. I want to think this through. And is there anything to be salvaged from this concept at all? Do you see anything?
Let me make a distinction here. People who are woke, like everyone else, are complex people. So in the moments where they're being woke, as I've defined it in the past few minutes, there is very little redeeming about that style of approaching politics. However, those same people often have important insights. When they are trying to persuade rather than bully, they can make as important and crucial points as anyone can. And there are very, very few people who have nothing at all of value to say. And so the point that there are forms of suffering that you're not likely to see if you're a white person compared to if you're a black person. Say you're a black man living in Brooklyn at the height of stop and frisk. Let's say you're a white person who's never felt the burden of being racially profiled. You understand what the word means in the abstract, but it's never hit you. And so you assume maybe it's a bit of a nuisance, but what are these people complaining so much about? You don't understand the deep insult that it is to feel presumed guilty when you know you're innocent by someone who has the backing of the state. That's a perfectly valid point. And it's a point that
Agreed.
the woke have been much quicker to recognize than the rest of society. It's also a point that does not need to be bullied into people. It's a point that, like any other, can be made through persuasion. And it's a point that is not, it's not aided by viewing politics in terms of just good and evil, right? I mean, I think there are many points like this. So, if you were to talk to a police officer and do the rather unpopular thing nowadays of looking at things from their point of view, you might find that there are similar insights to be had. I don't know what it's like to be in charge of keeping order, to be the person that all of society relegates the duty of dealing with the worst people in society. There are some psychopaths out there. There are some. I mean, listen. I live in New York. Living in New York, taking the subway every day, it impresses upon one the reality that human nature is not just a list of good qualities. There are just some crazy people out there, and what the police do is we just relegate the job to them of dealing with it, so we don't have to. That's not an easy job. What does that do to a person? I don't know. That's an interesting conversation to be had. What does it do to know that, roughly every day a cop gets shot somewhere in the country? That certainly does something to the consciousness of other cops who know that even though that's probably rather unlikely to happen to them, it still affects you in the same way that a black man seeing an unarmed black person get shot by the cops, it can very much affect you, even if you know statistically it's very unlikely to happen to you. So there are all of these kinds of insights that can be learned about people in a different social setting than you. And they ought to be learned through persuasion and storytelling and journalism and documentaries and conversation. But you can't get very far if you think of politics in terms of good and evil. And that is what I see wokeness as. I mean, the very term implies that it's religious in the sense that it's like, I've seen the truth. It's not all that complicated. It's all right here in this book. And all I have to do is get you to believe the truth.
It has a religious quality to it.
Yeah. That's not a helpful stance to take to politics. It assumes that you have nothing to learn yourself from the person that you're educating, right? Which, how could that be true? I don't know anyone who knows everything. So
I know people
in general,
who think they do.
Exactly. I mean, most of the interesting things I've learned in life are things that I didn't believe prior to reading or talking to someone.
Yeah.
Right? That's how you expand your horizon.
Thank you for engaging me so nuanced about woke culture. Hi, everyone. Just wanted to take a quick break and talk about my new book that's coming out April 7th. It's called Transcend, the New Science of Self-Actualization. Really excited to present this book to you all. It represents the culmination of many, many years of hard work and synthesis. What I've done in this book is I've taken Maslow's classic hierarchy of needs and I've revised it for the 21st century, trying to bring back humanistic psychology. I think that the field of humanistic psychology in the 50s and 60s really got a lot right about humanity and the creative possibilities of humans, as well as the humanitarian and spiritual possibilities. Really hoping this book can present a vision of humanity that transcends us all and helps us connect deeper with each other, but also help us reach our greatest potential individually and collectively. So if you want to check out this book, you can actually pre-order it right now on Amazon, as well as there's independent bookstores I think you can pre-order it from. And then on April 7th, starting April 7th, it should be in bookstores. A lot of people have been wondering throughout the years how they can support me and the Psychology Podcast. And here's the time. You're always welcome to contribute money to the podcast to help support it. If you're a long-time listener or even short-time listener, you want to not only support the podcast, but dive deeper into a lot of the concepts and ideas we talk about constantly on this show. This is a great way to do that by buying this book. So please check the book out and let me know what you think. So I want to talk about a topic that I know something about, the science of intelligence. and gifted education and discuss discuss a real hotly debated and poorly misunderstood still from a scientific perspective in terms of the causal factors, why African Americans on average are so strikingly underrepresented in gifted education programs. It is, and are so overrepresented in special education programs. This is a real important topic in my field, and we've been trying to look at it from all different kinds of perspectives. And I just wanted to get sort of your perspective on it and link it to your the term you coined, racial gapology, which suggests maybe we shouldn't be so focused on these gaps. So would you mind giving me some of your thoughts on this? As all these other topics today, I'm just here to kind of sit back and listen to your perspective. I'm genuinely curious to hear some of your thoughts about this.
Well, if you don't mind me turning it back to you, I'm curious, since you pay attention to this issue closely and empirically, I want to know what you think about the racial gap in gifted education and special ed as well.
So first, I want to, acknowledge I do think it's a problem. This particular disparity I do see as a problem. This disparity is so striking, and it is something that is such an important leverage to further education. Having gifted education resources does give you acceleration, gives you enhancement, it gives you a leg up in getting into good colleges. It's important. And so to have we're talking overwhelming, differences in this disparity, there's clearly a lot more that we should be doing. So the interesting question is, what in the world, what are these factors that are going on? So there's low-hanging fruit, and then there's much more complicated fruit, so to speak. The low-hanging fruit is, it is true that on average, African Americans don't get access to as good early childhood education programs. So from a developmental perspective on the development of intelligence, it is true and is the case that there are disparities that start very young. And as Keith Stanovich has noted, the rich do get richer, the poor do get poorer. These things do accumulate. IQ is not something that just you pop out, with the IQ kind of branded on your forehead, and that it doesn't change throughout your entire life. There is, from a within-person perspective, IQ can be developed. So I think there's low-hanging fruit in terms of giving everyone access to the same quality early childhood education, healthcare. There are certainly economic and environmental disparities that play some role in this. But I think people have a prior that kind of need to be working with a different prior here. So it is true that if you just look at the average differences in IQ between African Americans and Caucasians on average, it still is sizable. And if you look at the tails of the distribution, you could expect there to be a huge disparity in gifted education based on IQ differences alone, and even if you don't look at any other factors. So I think that is true to a certain degree. And that's, but then that moves the buck, and you have to explain, well, what is the difference? What is explaining the IQ disparity? And that is a very interesting, important question. But I think that's what needs explaining. I think that's what we really need to zoom in on, as opposed to the prior of, well, there's a disparity in gifted talent education. It's because of racism. So
you're saying we need to focus on which part of it?
What are the causes of such a disparity in IQ? Yeah. So the factors that we use to accept people into gifted programs, it is a fact that African Americans on average don't do as well in those metrics. So they're not getting into the programs. I don't think that racism is 100% the explanation of the disparity. The prior is really understanding, well, what are all the developmental... I mentioned some low-hanging fruit, that the access to early childhood education does affect development of intelligence.
You're thinking like pre-K, right?
Yeah.
Pre-K. Yeah. I agree. And I think, I don't pay super close attention, but we seem to be learning more and more about the ill effects of air pollution, even at low levels, and environmental factors on cognitive development. And virtually any way you slice this, the median black kid is getting a different dose of environmental particulates in the air and a worse dose than the median white kid.
And by the way, lead in particular, that's one example. Lead has been shown to, Alan Kaufman has shown that to have a pretty sizable effect. I mean, it doesn't explain all of it, obviously. Yeah.
Yeah, I think people vastly underrate the effect of rising blood lead levels on the crime wave in the 70s, 80s, and on the crime decline in the 90s. There's a great book called Lucifer Curves by the economist Rick Nevin that was really persuasive on that point. But, once one has dealt with all of those things, I think realistically the disparities are going to persist. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't deal with those things. I mean, the way I want to approach this is by de-emphasizing the racial disparity and emphasizing the moral imperative of making of enhancing cognitive development for the people at the bottom of society.
Right.
I mean, so like if we were to just focus on quote unquote white people and divide them by ancestry, so that we're talking about white Americans of Irish descent versus Polish descent versus Italian descent versus Norwegian descent, we would no doubt find disparities in high school graduation rates, SAT scores, college admissions rates, GPAs. All the research I've seen, whether it's income, wealth, incarceration rates from 100 years ago, back when they used to gather such fine-grained data, showed often massive disparities, including in IQ. We could make much of those, but it's not clear that we would be doing a good thing, right? Why not just, if universal pre-K is a good idea, for example, why not just do it? And, disparity be damned. If it's a good idea, if it's helping the people at the bottom, then we don't need to focus on the distance between them and some other arbitrarily defined group. Given we're slicing in the grand scheme of history, the way we're slicing up humans in America, black versus white, these categories are, they are social constructs that could be constructed differently. We could just compare Jamaicans to Black Americans to Nigerians, and there would be something equally valid about that. And when we do that for income, we find big disparities that nobody cares about. The point is, the categories mislead us. We treat them as like pre-philosophical givens, that just like essences that exist out there in the world, and we anchor our concerns about education to those categories, failing to realize how arbitrary they are and how very recently they were different, and no doubt in the future they'll be different. When we could just be focusing on those kids, whatever they look like, who are not getting adequate pre-K education, who are exposed to, negative environmental factors, and just institute the policies that help them, and then not focus on the gaps. That would be and then you don't necessarily have to deal with the very thorny questions of race and IQ and, genes versus culture. That seems like a pretty sound answer in my view, but it would require getting rid of the obsession with racial gaps in outcome, which is too much for many people.
Too much for many people.
What do you think of that?
Well, I had Flynn of the Flynn Effect fame.
I remember that
on my podcast.
That's great.
And he is really adamant that that a lot of it has to do with Black culture. And Black culture seems like, and which is an environmental variable. But I've heard you kind of talking about this in other places, that maybe that might play a role. Now, what I'm trying to understand is, I mean, are you being hypocritical at all yourself? Like, you do talk about this topic on like every podcast I listen to, and you are interested in the effect of maybe some race relevant variables on gaps. So
Mm-hmm.
is your ideal world a one where then you wouldn't be talking about this topic anymore?
Mm-hmm.
Do you see what I'm saying? I'm a little
Yeah,
confused.
I do. I mean, I haven't talked about that actually in a pretty long while.
Okay.
Haven't wrote about it in a while either. And yeah, I do think my views have evolved in the sense that I'm happy to talk about the sources of disparities in general. So like, the fact that, basically every survey that asks Black kids, white kids, Asian kids, how many hours per night do you study? What it finds is that Black kids study fewer hours than white kids on average, who study fewer hours than Asian kids, which comports perfectly with my own experience having grown up in like a very diverse community, observing differences in home life. So that's a very strong reality. It's also something that is not likely to be changed by me talking about it. Podcasting, that's something. So the problem with culture is that it's only really changed, I think, by local face-to-face kind of circumstances. Like if you're a church, you have a much better chance of changing attitudes towards homework in your town than I do by talking about it on a podcast. I think in that sense, people tend to underrate the importance of local policies, not even policies, local voluntary network organizations, and overrate like what the federal or state government can do to, quote, solve a problem. A lot of problems are actually in practice only solvable at the community level, because they're the kinds of problems that can only be influenced on a face-to-face level by people who know the particular circumstances of a particular community. And I think culture doesn't completely, but often falls into that category. Which is why when I'm thinking about policy, I do think the focus should not be on looking at racial disparities. If that makes sense.
Well, I think that there's great value in looking at policies that will rise the tide for everyone, and you said particularly those at the bottom.
Yeah.
And I guess the define what is the bottom? How do you define that? Are we talking about just SES? Are we talking about in terms, what does that mean? But so I think there's great value in that. What I'm trying to logically think through here is like, well, what if there are certain variables that are race specific, though, that do create certain inequalities for particular groups? Are you saying we should ignore that?
So, I mean, if we're talking about culture,
yeah.
Culture is not the same as race. It's often correlated with race. So, for example, the average household culture of the typical Nigerian immigrant to America is vastly different than the average household culture of the typical Black American descended from American slavery. They are of the same race, but very different cultures in basically every way you could think of, including attitudes toward education.
Well, and that's primarily, I just want to clarify, that's primarily what I'm talking about when I talk about, like, I even use phrases like Black culture, and people could argue, what the heck does that even mean? But
Right.
I'm arguing about attitudes towards education and the kind of stigmatization that people within a certain culture might experience for expressing aspirations, particular aspirations. I just wanted to be clear what I was referring to.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm zooming in on. Yeah.
Right. So, that need not necessarily be talked about as a racial phenomenon.
Okay.
because it's not, strictly speaking, right? It's a phenomenon that is very disproportionate in that far more, I've never met a single Asian American kid who got teased for being a sort of traitor to his race for liking school or for walking around with a book or for trying hard in class. I'm not saying it's never happened. I'm saying it's very atypical.
Right, because part
Whereas
of that
many black
culture
kids
is hard
do.
work. Right.
That's right. Whereas many black kids would get the sense or be teased for acting white if they go to a particular kind of school and if they try very hard in school.
Right. I'm trying to think, what are the effects of that? Like,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the effects of that are only bad.
Right.
So, how does one, so, I mean, that is the kind of problem, though, that I think is more liable to local intervention, and it's certainly a good thing to be able to talk about it on a podcast, but probably what is more responsive to, anywhere that I'm writing or talking, the audience is like implicitly the nation, and even like parts of Europe, like implicitly like the English speaking world. That would be different if I, like if I give a talk at the local charter school. I'm much more comfortable talking about that kind of thing because it actually it has more of a chance of landing as an important causal variable for positive change because of the nature of how culture operates. So when the audience is implicitly the nation, it's not that I don't want to talk about those things. It's just that I think there's a more important message, which is that focusing on racial disparities as if racial disparities are a proxy for human well-being is a mistake, a very important intellectual error.
I'd love to see you develop that argument even further as the years go on. I'm so curious to see where your career goes, and it's been a delight for me to even just see in have I known you just a year?
Maybe a little more than that.
A little more than that.
Yeah.
How your own thinking has evolved, and even your thinking on reparations has evolved, and or at least has shifted in various ways. And can you kind of leave right now kind of a vision you have for the good society?
Oh.
What is your Martin Luther speech look like right now on where I should say the Coleman Hughes speech, February 8th, 2020. Where is it looking right now?
Well, so we're human beings with a human nature that is part good and part bad. That's complex. Part of that complexity is an inherent urge to form tribes, to delineate my group of people, separate it from yours, to feel more empathy for mine, less for yours. That will never go away, whether that is defined by race, by interests, by religion, by politics. But that's a instinctual and first order urge that humans have. Humans also have the capacity to reflect on their first order urges and emotions and rationally develop principles that make sense upon reflection, that make moral sense upon reflection. And one of those principles is the colorblind ideal, right? And at a first order level, everyone sees race and can't help but see it, and it matters. But upon reflection, most people can come to realize, or be made to realize, or be persuaded that race actually does not matter. It really is, upon reflection, just your skin color. And so my vision is for more and more people to reflect, to go past the first order urge that says, this is my group, that's yours. That first order urge that will always be there. And to reach the second order level where the idea of colorblindness as a moral principle guides our policymaking, guides how we seek to treat other people and demand to be treated ourselves, and guides our sense of how much we can expand the circle of concern and empathy as one human family.
Well, brother, I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope you felt as though your views were fairly represented and had a chance for airing, because I really just wanted to kind of just sit back and kind of listen to you today.
Awesome, Scott. Thank you so much.
I wish you well.
You too.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Psychology Podcast. If you'd like to react in some way to something you heard, I encourage you to join in the discussion below. Also, please add a rating and review of the podcast on iTunes, and subscribe to the Psychology Podcast YouTube channel, as we're really trying to increase our viewership on YouTube. Thanks for being such a great supporter of this podcast, and be sure to tune in next time for more on the mind, brain, behavior, and creativity.